It's worth having a conversation with a lawyer.
Right.
If you're coming into the marriage with assets or with a first family,
Right.
like you want to try to protect.
Right.
Hi, Joel.
Hey, Ames.
How's it going?
Good. How are you doing?
Love's in the air today.
Ooh, I feel it. Why love, though?
We've got a really romantic episode coming up. We're talking about cohabitation agreements and domestic contracts, also known as like what we always call prenups.
Prenups, yep.
Isn't that lovely?
Sounds like a lot of fun.
But it's one of those topics that I think is very important, but not a lot of couples like to talk about it. It's one of those kind of, not so romantic. It takes the love out of things, but it's an important conversation.
I agree. It's so important that the second you bring it up these days and dates, you're a write-off.
Yeah, it's not a good first
Looking
topic.
forward to the talk, though.
Yeah, but we've got Alex Carr joining us
Sweet.
from her family law practice, LH&C Family Law here in Toronto.
Cool.
So she's coming up next to help us understand what those things are and what's involved and why we should chat about them.
Sounds great.
So welcome back, everybody. Today we have a very interesting episode, and we're very excited to have Alex Carr joining us as a partner with LH&C Family Law here in Toronto.
Welcome, Alex.
Alex,
Guys.
we're excited to have you because this has been a topic that comes up more and more often. And today we're going to task you with chatting with us about cohabitation agreements and prenuptial agreements or prenups. It still feels at this day and age, there's still a lot of misconceptions and there's still a stigma attached to it. And it's not only about people getting together, at younger ages. We're seeing clients in their second marriages or relationships. It's
Extended families.
yeah,
and stuff
it's a lot of the financial planning pieces that go along with it. So we've got lots of questions for you today. So thank you for joining us.
Alex.
I'm ready for it. I should just say, as a start, I probably should have mentioned this before. Prenups is what they call it in the U.S. So we're very familiar with the term because it's what they call it on TV. In
Right.
Canada, we
Okay.
call it a domestic contract.
Oh, see?
Interesting.
Very
Cool.
good.
Sweet.
Let's start using the proper
Domestic
term.
contract. Got it.
So first off, maybe let's start with one of the things around common law. Like what does common law mean in Ontario? Like what's the definition of that currently? Because I know it has changed and there's been things. It's like, but what is that right now?
The definition of common law in Ontario is either you have to have lived together and have a child together, or have lived together for 3 years. That's what triggers you being common law spouses.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Child together, meaning it's your child, or what if you live together and you had a child from another marriage? Is that common law?
I guess someone can make that argument, but
See?
it would depend, I guess,
complicated.
on the I'll call it the step parents' relationship with
Right.
that child.
Right. So it could be argued that. That's good to know. That's very good to know.
Yep.
Why do you feel, and I guess in your line of business, have you seen, because you cover family laws, which is more than just what we're talking about today, but have you seen an increase in couples going to get domestic contracts or cohabitation agreements? Has there been an uptick, or is it still about the same from the beginning?
No, I would say anecdotally pretty similar
Yeah.
from when I started practicing family law, which was 2014, so not that long ago.
Right, right. Why do you think that is? Like, or I guess the first question is, do you think more people should be doing these things?
I think that it's worth having a conversation with a lawyer
Right.
if you're coming into the marriage with assets or with a first family,
Right.
Like you want to try to protect.
Right.
Whether or not you end up deciding that a marriage contract is the right tool for
Right.
you is a different question, but I think
Right.
it's worth having that conversation
To
and
discover that.
understanding how do things work. Usually when you have a first family, you understand.
Yes. Yeah.
But if you're coming into the marriage with assets, or you make a significant amount of money,
Right.
or really different amount of money than your spouse, or you guys have talked about the fact that one of you is going to be slowing down in their career to raise kids. I think all of those types of factors are things that you would want to discuss with the family law,
Right.
trying to figure out what the effect might be if you don't have a contract.
Which kind of goes back to, I'm surprised we haven't seen an uptick in people doing these things, or at least talking about them, because I just think about my parents, right? They got together when they were 20 and 21. That's when they got married. They didn't really have anything at that time. So there was really nothing to discuss. But I feel, a lot of folks are getting together later in life, where perhaps they might have student debts, or they might have more work under their belt and might have more investable assets or properties. Again, the second relationship where they're now going through, to your point, they have kids and assets and things like that. So I'm surprised there hasn't really been an uptick, but I think there's that.
There may have
Yeah. I just think it's interesting because, again, we see from our clients, and I had a chat last week with a client, and it's a second relationship.
Yeah.
They're talking about marriage. She already has a teenager. And it was almost a conversation of like, I don't know if I should bring that up.
And she was timid.
She was nervous about it. Like, I don't want to ruin the relationship because, does it make me feel like I'm not trusting my partner, or I think that this isn't, maybe I'm predicting that it's not going to last. So there's this hesitation.
Yeah, I think that's common to have a bit of a hesitation about it. I always think about it like one of the things you do when you negotiate a marriage contract is you exchange financial disclosure. So you go into the marriage with eyes wide open about what your partner's financial circumstances are, which you may not otherwise.
Right.
Plenty of we probably all know plenty of couples who don't actually know.
We got swept up in the romance of it all, and it's like, oh, you have how much debt now? Wait a second.
Exactly. So you could compare it to going into a relationship without knowing if the other person wants to have kids, or there are things that I think are worth discussing before
100%
getting married.
Well, and I think if you look at a lot of relationships that why they fail, money tends to be one of the common reasons for divorce or discourse or arguments in the household. So you're right, by being transparent, and I think that's the whole process is just trying to be transparent about it, right? And so it's not always about, to your point, the agreements in place, but it's adding that level of transparency so that everybody's on the same page.
Totally.
And that's a big part of what we do is the financial planning piece, right? And it's just like, you have to talk about it and you have to look at it so that
For sure.
manage expectations, right?
For sure.
So, Joel, you bring this up on date 2, which I think is a little...
I think it's prudent. I think it's important to bring up the fact that if this relationship was to continue, if we were to live with each other, I'd want a cohabitation agreement.
That's amazing.
Mind you, some of them have said
has that gone for you?
probably not the greatest sometimes. I'll be honest.
You always
They
have to
just
pay
get
for
off the
dinner.
top,
Yeah.
of course, that's for sure. But they just obviously sometimes. I did have literally one time where she just left. She's just like, okay, I did not think that you'd bring that up on the second date, and she just got up and left. I was like, well, thank you then.
Yeah.
But just following up or circling back, Amy, to what you were saying, I think it's an important thing to learn to bring up with your potential spouse, just because I'm looking at it from my age group. I'm 34 years old, and I'd say the majority of my friends that have spouses and have kids, not the extreme majority, but I would say the most, are common law are near a common law relationship rather than a marriage relationship, right? Now, whether you want to agree, I know in Ontario there's a misconception, and I learned this, not too long ago, obviously, but you learn that common law spousal rights are different than marriage rights. This is not, I think BC and Quebec, it's the exact same thing upon a breakup. But in Ontario, one thing, for example, that a lot of people think to believe is because, a lot of it is, I'd say, influenced by the United States, where common law relationships upon the breakdown of a marriage, similar to or the breakdown of a common law relationship, you'd have access to the other individuals' assets, which is not the case by default in Ontario. But the point is, I think it's important to bring up or to talk about this, and because not too many people are going down the marriage route for financial reasons or for other reasons. And I've noticed that, even me, like when I first started bringing this up with a potential spouse, it was very awkward. Like one of the questions I always get asked is like, are you getting into this with the intention of breaking up with me? And the answer is like, no. It's just that, statistically speaking, there's a 70% chance you and I will not.
70?
It's not. It's a little bit less than that, but I'm talking about my.
But actually, you bring up a good question, Alex. Yeah. Marriage and common law are not the same thing, right?
No, they're not. In Ontario, you don't have a right to divide property if you're not married.
Right.
There's equitable claims you can make, but it's not like a legislated
it's not the same.
Right.
Right.
To just like divide everything 50-50.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
It's a bit more complicated than that.
Right. Right.
Yeah, precisely. So I think it's crucial, and it's protection for the individual, like the other individual, and for myself. And I don't think, so I follow this lawyer in the U.S. named James Sexton, and he's a really famous lawyer down in the U.S. and he's great. Like I love his energy, I love his passion, and he brings up a lot of good points. It's like you talk about, when you meet a spouse, like you talk about the most important issues, right? Like whether you want to have kids, where would you want to raise your kids, what schools would they, like you bring up the most pressing matters and the most pressing issues. And one thing I've always been, not always, recently been critical of is how come we don't treat financials the same way? Because as you said, earlier, Amy, like a lot of times financials break a relationship. If there's a difference in the way two people should be spending their money or saving their money or what to do with their money, it can create a lot of tension between the two partners. And I'd like to see more people bring that up, maybe on the first date too.
Well, maybe it's they don't know what to expect. And I think this is what we were hoping to get from you today, Alex, is to really understand what can somebody expect? So they engage.
What's the process?
Yeah, what's the process? Okay. They engage a lawyer. Like, what am I getting into? Like, are we're in rooms arguing, or like, well, how does this work?
Yeah. So, what needs to happen in order? So you would obviously go meet with your lawyer. You'd give them the background. You'd give them the facts. And your lawyer would kind of explain to you how.
Is it prudent for each one of them to have their own separate lawyers?
They have to have their own lawyer.
They have to have their own lawyers. Okay.
Right. So in order for the domestic contract to be binding,
right?
Three things need to happen. Everybody has to have their independent legal advice.
Yep.
They need to exchange financial disclosure, and the agreement needs to be witnessed.
Right.
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 So they would need to, everybody goes to their own lawyer. It's pretty typical for the person who has more assets, especially if the other person like doesn't have a big income or,
right.
really has less. It's typical for that person to sometimes pay the other person's lawyer too.
Okay.
But it is important to both have independent legal advice.
Right. Right.
So they would come in, they would talk to a lawyer. The lawyer would explain how things work, get an idea of what the client wanted, but also provide their view on like what's realistic. You know, like if I'm meeting with a 29-year-old man who has, who has like a good job, and he tells me he's going to get married and he expects that his spouse is going to stay home and he wants to contract out his spousal support and not ever divide property. I'm going to be like, okay, well, that might not stand up.
Yeah.
So
you can write it, but it might not hold.
Stand up. You mean like the court might strike it? Like, a judge may be like, you know what, I'm not listening to this agreement.
If it's a very unfair agreement to one side, like it
might not hold in court. Yeah.
Right.
So it has to like stay within a realm of
being realistic.
Reasonable.
Yeah.
Reasonable.
Right.
So they would kind of discuss that with you. They would help you, once retained, they would help you put together your financial disclosure for the other side. And they would have a conversation with the other side's lawyer about like the terms that, you the first lawyer and their client had been talking about.
And when you say terms, like what types of terms are typically put into these types of contracts?
Good question.
Oh, okay. So how are we going to deal with spousal support? So let's say like I have a client who makes...
So income, right? So
Yeah, like let's say I have a client who makes, $2 million. That can be in Ontario, we have like very generous support obligations.
Right.
So, it can be a bit of a wealth transfer if you
Right.
make a lot of money.
Right.
So like, are we going to cap this person's income? Are we going to like cap the duration of spousal support depending on the length of the relationship? Are we going to say that there is no spousal support paid until you have a kid together? You've been married a certain number of years. Like,
Right.
There are lots of things that you can do.
Right.
We can also in family law in Ontario, there's this really silly rule about the matrimonial home that family lawyers hate, which
Right.
is that if you come into a marriage with a house, and that is the house that you live in, and like at your matrimonial home, that's the house that you spend most time in.
Right.
At the date that you separate, you don't get a deduction for what you came into the marriage with.
Right.
So if
That is a very silly rule.
if I own a house that's $1 million and you and I get married, Amy, and we separate
Now that's like,
a year later, let's
right.
say,
Right.
you're entitled to half the value of the house. There's some exceptions.
I did very well.
That's the biggest investment you made. $500,000 a year. Amy. That's a pretty damn good investment. 0 to $500,000.
So there's no way to
I should say there's some qualification to that, because if you've been married for less than 5 years, you have argument that like,
Right.
Yeah.
you should
Right.
receive 50%. But let's say you're married for 6 years.
Right.
Yeah.
Then away you go.
Yeah.
Right. And
Imagine,
there's
like, on a
no,
$5
so the
million house.
matrimonial home is treated very differently.
So a lot of people, especially when they come into the marriage with a home, they want to protect their date of marriage interest. In
Right.
that home.
Right. Versus if I had a non-registered account of $1 million and we got married and we separated, that's treated maybe perhaps
You'd get
differently.
the
Right.
date of marriage deduction.
Right.
You get and actually the silly thing about this rule is that if we sell that house before we separate, then I get the date of marriage deduction.
Wow. Okay. So if you, yeah.
You get the date of marriage deduction.
So if I was pre-planning, no.
If you knew this, you would switch homes. You'd move homes before.
See, look, we've learned some very important tip there. That is good to know. But you're right. Okay, the matrimonial home. So, okay, looking at the real estate assets, we talked about what else types of these spousal support.
Often people get marriage contracts if their family has a lot of money and they know they're going to get like
An
significant
inheritance.
Inheritances are excluded from sharing in property division, but it's not like tracing that inheritance can sometimes be difficult.
Because once it kind of gets commingled, it can get a little
They're like,
messy.
well, do big renovation on the matrimonial home.
Right. Right.
So just kind of spelling out that, okay, like I might receive this inheritance. I might
Right.
even put it in the matrimonial home, but I'm still going to get that exclusion.
Right. And what about we work with a lot of business owners. So again, if they're coming into a relationship and they had a business, is that something that also gets kind of worked in?
Yeah. So like some people, especially if they're getting married later in life,
Yeah.
50s, 60s, and they've built this successful business.
Right.
They're like coming in with something, and when you're wealthy, it's easier to build wealth.
Right.
So sometimes, and maybe they have like kids that they want to leave their assets
Right.
to, and
Right.
they're repartnering, but they're not going to have kids with this new partner.
Right.
They may not want to divide property at all, and they might want to get married, but
Right.
not divide property at
Right.
all.
Right.
They might want to just be completely separate as to property, or they may want to say that my business interests are excluded from sharing.
Right.
There's lots of
And beneficiaries of trust. What if like your family had a trust set up for you and you're one of the beneficiaries? How does that work? Can you also include that in there?
you can exclude that.
You can
Right.
exclude that.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you brought up a good point too, just talking about kind of that later in life relationship where it brings it up. So one thing I think you're right, having a conversation with a lawyer just to understand what these things mean, whether you put a contract in place or not. Oftentimes we'll see clients where they're going through a divorce. Both sides aren't really educated on what is reasonable. And so you see them spend an awful lot of time arguing and playing games and spending a lot of time dealing with lawyers and things like that. When if they actually went in and understood in the first place what would be reasonable if this, in the event that it fails, what that looks like. So your point, you're going in eyes wide open, but equally, if it doesn't work out, you know what the possibility might look like.
Yeah, I also think that like negotiating a marriage contract, whether it's done through the lawyers or you guys talk about it yourselves, like it gives you a bit of a taste of like what they're going to be like.
Right.
You know, if it does.
It shows the personality real fast.
Yeah, exactly. That's why Jalal just cuts to the chase. Second date right there.
But it's a really fair point.
Like it can raise some red flags, you know.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to ask as well, like, okay, so putting me on this, put my dating life onto the side. How soon, Alex, do you think is it prudent for a couple to bring such a thing up to the attention of, for example, or to seek out a lawyer? Or by the way, does it have to be a lawyer, or could it be a notary public?
No, it's got to be a lawyer.
It's got to be a lawyer. Okay, so how soon or at what stage of a relationship do you think is most optimal to get the most
Some guys
transparency?
So like
Asking for a friend.
So I think that as soon as you know that like you're either going to move in together or you're going to get married, having that conversation, and like I would just say, meet with the lawyer well in advance of the wedding date.
Right.
Well in advance of the
Well, advance but putting the deposit too.
Yeah.
I'm getting, you don't get the deposit back. Come on.
Yeah.
So
yes.
Cool. I just had one. Sorry.
No,
Amy,
go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
You were talking. You were speaking earlier about just to circle back about when clients come up to you, for example, to look at a potential marriage contract. Have you noticed any patterns of the individuals that come in? Like what are things? Have you noticed any patterns or qualifications that most of these people come in with? Is it generally only reserved, or not reserved, I would say, but is it only people who come in that have a lot of assets or have a lot of money that are interested in these marriage contracts, or no?
Typically, one of them has money.
Okay, so it's not
Or
generally both of them. Could be one of them.
Yeah, or a first family.
Yeah.
Or
I was
first
going to say,
family,
if you have kids and stuff, it gets more complicated. Again, the scenario I was talking about, the client who has a son, and it was, I'm going to get married, but I don't really want to bring this up. I'm thinking, but what about your kid? And then once we got that kind of, it was like, oh yeah, like I really want to make sure he's protected, and that all my hard work up to this point is going to benefit my son. And so it's having those,
especially if you're going to buy a house together, if you're going to own it as joint tenants, which means that like if something happens to you, then your interest passes to your joint tenant.
And do you have to disclose international assets?
Yes.
You have to?
Yeah.
Even though Canada has no jurisdiction over assets.
You have to, if you don't disclose an asset and it's later found out that you failed to disclose an asset, the agreement can be set aside.
Oh yeah, okay, that'd be a breach.
Don't play any games.
It's like in your interest to disclose as much, everything.
Right. Just protect. If you're going to marry or live with somebody, you should probably just disclose it anyways.
To disclose that secret account in the Bahamas.
Jalal's going to die alone.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, one of the quotes I liked, and I really like this one, it said prenups, or again, domestic contracts are not about expecting failure, but it's about planning for all possibilities. So to your point, again, it's just looking at all the different options and how things could potentially unfold so that nobody's surprised or caught flat-footed. It's like, okay, here's what this looks like.
Yeah. Yeah, and having those conversations, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think it's, I don't know, I think it's prudent either way. Like, I think, even if you don't have money, so maybe it's not worth doing a domestic contract. Like, I think having some conversation about, like, okay, are either of us going to stay home? Are we planning to make career sacrifices for the benefit of the kids?
Right.
Are we going to have kids? Like, how are we...
Yeah.
How are we splitting expenses? Who's paying? Are we having a joint credit card? How is it work?
It's so funny because like those conversations a lot of times don't happen, right? They really, really don't. It's more just we like being together and things are great. And no, I don't know, maybe we're taught not to talk about the money stuff, right? So we're not going to bring
it up. In the rare
up.
instance they are talked about, it's like frowned upon.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's funny.
So I think definitely we should talk about it. And you seem like a lovely person to talk to. So like, I don't know why we're so scared.
Exactly. Lawyers are not scary, everyone.
Alex, from your perspective, like what would be, I guess, some of your like a good tip for people if they're listening to this now and they're like, okay, like maybe I'm getting close to becoming a common law, or I'm thinking about going down that path, or perhaps thinking about marriage. Like what would be like one of the top few things that I should be thinking about in this area?
I think just like being careful who you own property with.
Right.
Nice.
Being careful about like documenting
Right.
things in a careful way.
Right.
So, you know, if you have a partner and things are great and you're like, okay, I'll just put the house in her name. Like just
Right.
talk to a lawyer before you do things.
Right.
Like that,
Right.
You know?
It's hard to do after the fact, right?
Yeah, like before you make a major decision, like a major financial decision, make sure you understand the implications of it.
Right. And then maybe you choose to go forward, but at least you understand what that looks like,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah, and if you don't, ask questions. You know, seek out a professional. If you don't have the answers to these questions.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Well, Alex, thank you. That's been helpful. I think we all learned something new today. And Joel, don't bring it up on date 2. Don't do it. That's the tip of the day. Yeah. Yeah, wait till 5. That's the magic number.
Got it. 5.
Thanks again. Till next time.